As always, Josh Constantinou here is the Coordinated Access Coordinator hosting and riding alongside Conor.
Yes, Conor Mullin, President of the Board of John Howard PEI. Hi, everyone.
All right, so let's turn it over to the two guests that we have here today. If you two want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. My name is Sophia Hussain. I'm the Director of Policy at the John Howard Society of Ontario. So over in Ontario, we have our provincial office has a Center for Research and Policy where we do sort of applied research projects, develop policy solutions to address issues in sort of the criminal justice space, public education work and government relations on behalf of the local offices that do the direct services and programs for people across the province. So my role is to help develop those policy positions and policy solutions to address the issues that we're seeing in the system on things from housing, employment, which we'll talk about today, to issues around corrections and reintegration. So yeah, we're really excited to get into the conversation today. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having us. My name's Hannah Cook, and I am the Research and Evaluation Analyst at the John Howard Society of Ontario. So similar to what Sophia said, but I do a lot of our research on the local issues going on in the criminal justice system within Ontario. As well, I will do program evaluations of our local office programs. And I am also the lead researcher and author of the research report we'll be talking about today.
Fantastic.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for being here with us today, guys. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yes, it'll be fun to delve in more into the research that you referenced. In the meantime, as we often do, let's go through kind of where we're at. Conor, got anything from a board level that you want to update or share us on?
Yeah, a couple of things. So as I mentioned on previous podcasts, we do have the John Howard Society of Canada annual general meeting coming up in Calgary in a couple of weeks. I'll be attending that with our executive director, Keith Hillier, and another board member, Rob Elaine. So really looking forward to that. We've been getting ready for that, preparing reports on the work that John Howard PEI has done over the last year. So that'll be very exciting. Looking forward to that. We are actively recruiting currently for board members. So if there is anyone out there listening who's interested in the work the John Howard Society does, wants to learn more, or would potentially be interested in joining our board of directors, please reach out and you can apply, and we'll certainly meet with you and be happy to chat with anyone who's interested. In fact, I think we might actually have a volunteer board member ad up on Indeed.
The website as well.
Or certainly on the website. So check the website for sure, and you can see a little bit more about that opportunity. Probably, or I guess there's something else exciting that happened this week. John Howard Society was invited to appear before the Legislative Standing Committee on Health and Social Development to provide a briefing on the work that we do in relation to homelessness, and in particular the point in time count that just occurred. And Josh, I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later. But our Keith, our executive director, appeared at that to provide a briefing, and that went very well. If anyone's interested in that, again, learning more about what we do, you can find that on the PEI Legislature's Facebook page, or also on the legislature's website. You can find links to watch that appearance.
I think their YouTube channel had the live stream as well.
Okay, very good. And then, but to say probably the biggest thing, and something that we've been talking about for the past few months, is that today the formal announcement was made announcing the launch of our Veterans Homelessness Program in collaboration with the Government of Canada. So we were up in Summerside earlier this morning with MP Bobby Morrissey and Deputy Mayor of Summerside Corey Snow making that announcement. The program's been in the works for a long time, and some of the groundwork's kind of already started, but today was the formal announcement of that, and that's been the culmination of a lot of hard work. So we're very happy to have that formally launched and running on all fours now.
Yeah, no, it was exciting to get that finalized. You know, like you said, it's been sort of in the works. This program's, we've known about it since, early in the year, certainly by April. We've been recruiting for hiring someone, got that taken care of. We're in the process of developing what it's going to look like. So this was sort of the biggest missing piece on the checklist.
Yep, I'd say we had some good attendance there from members of the veterans community. There were representatives of some Legion organizations there, and certainly they're going to be an important community partner in this program. So I was certainly happy to have them there and have the opportunity to have a little chat and share information about the program. So it was great. It was a great announcement to get to be a part of this morning.
Yeah, no, I think it was an appropriate spot and appropriate time to get that taken care of.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for sharing that, Conor. So you touched on the point in time count, which it seems impossible for me to do anything but talk about these days. It is literally wrapping up at 11:59 p.m. tonight. So we started our enumeration period last Monday, September 30th, at 8 o'clock at night and ran till Tuesday, October 1st at 8 o'clock at night. So we completed the enumeration count last week, and then we have our extended survey period that's been going on since then. And as I said, ends tonight at 11:59. So I've already begun the process of collecting surveys and from some of the organizations who, whether shelters or transitional housing, and they've gotten everybody that they're going to get. So there'll be more of that going on next week. And then myself, Jane, and 2 data entry volunteers that we've recruited will begin entering all of those into the database on Wednesday. So
That's exciting stuff. I'm excited. As we've mentioned before, this is the first year that the point in time count has included rural areas of PEI, and the first time it's included Kings County at all.
yes.
So looking very forward to seeing those numbers and to getting a more accurate count of homelessness on PEI than maybe we've had to date. So
That's my hope as well. I think if nothing else, we'll certainly have a clearer picture of what that looks like to pair with likely a more accurate number as well.
absolutely.
So very excited to get that going. This has been in the works for the better part of a year, and now it's essentially happened, and we're into the data entry phase next week. And slowly but surely, we'll churn our way through that as we get towards putting together some data and information.
And then that will be that will be released publicly.
At some point, yeah,
Yeah.
we have to submit it to Government of Canada, and
Right.
they have to approve the final report, and then we submit the summary. Release the summary.
Exciting. Yes. So stay tuned for that, everyone. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are curious to see what that number is going to be.
Yeah, much like we are. Outside of that, I think most programs have been business as usual.
Yeah.
Lots of things up and running. No real significant changes or updates that come to mind for me anyway.
No, I don't think I've heard of anything either. No, we've been talking quite a bit lately about the volunteer tax program.
Yes.
That we had most recently a session at the John Howard Society office attended by some members, some CRA members.
Yeah.
And I think that was well attended. And again, the feedback on those programs seems to be quite good. I don't know if there's any new ones planned.
I think they may have taken a hiatus over the summer there.
Yeah.
So that might be something that gets back up and running here in the fall
sure.
at this point.
And and tax season is rapidly approaching anyway, so that program will again be running full steam ahead pretty soon again, I'm sure.
Yeah, and as we get to year end, people like to wrap things up before we hit the beginning of the next year.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, anything else you want to share before we get Sophia and Hannah involved here?
I think that's everything for me for now.
Okay. All right, Sophia, Hannah, thank you for patiently waiting through our updates and hanging by the side there. So in whatever way you want to go about it, and whoever wants to take the lead, if you can just sort of provide a bit of an update, overview of the research that we brought you here to talk about today, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, that would be great. So maybe I can start and just give kind of an overview of why we decided to look at this and what led to this research. And then I'll turn it over to Hannah to talk about the actual findings. But as folks, your listeners and you would well know, we're very aware of the barriers that exist for job seekers with criminal records, and some of the challenges that they experience when trying to find employment. Also realizing the importance of employment in terms of successful reintegration. So that's been a sort of focus point of our work in terms of research and policy for a number of years. And there had been some research we've done in the past that looked at talking to employers and sort of getting their perspectives on where those barriers come from and some of their practices, understanding how they conduct criminal record checks. But those other research projects were more focused on certain areas in the province. They weren't as big in sort of geographical scope. And so this research was a way to broaden that out a little bit. And it did involve reaching out to employers from across Canada, 400 in total that we actually surveyed. So we could get a broad overview of how employers, their perspectives and practices when it comes to doing criminal record checks and potentially hiring individuals with criminal records. So maybe I can turn it over to Hannah to talk a little bit about how the research was conducted and what we found.
Yeah, for sure. So for this study, it was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, otherwise known as SSHRC. And for this study, we worked with a team of academics across North America who have expertise on the intersections between employment and reintegration. For this project, we did work with a polling company to help us survey 400 hiring managers across the country, all of which were directly involved in hiring decisions at their organizations. So while for this survey, we recruited participants from all over Canada, I will note that a significant portion did reside in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, and we weren't able to get anyone from the Northern Territories as well. So through this research, there were 5 key findings that really stood out to us. The first finding was that while the majority said that they support the idea of successful reintegration for individuals with criminal records, there is still a lot of stigma which may be impacting those hiring decisions. Specifically, more than half of the respondents shared that they did view these candidates with criminal records to be high-risk hires. They believed that they had lower credentials compared to those without records. And some even describe them as being more challenging employees or dishonest individuals overall. And interestingly, those who noted later in the survey that they had actual experience hiring people with criminal records, they actually rated these individuals more positively compared to those without experience hiring people with records. And then moving on to our second key finding, which showed that criminal record checks do continue to be a central part of the hiring process for many employers. In fact, 60% of the respondents felt that criminal record checks should be required for all applicants. And then a little over half actually confirmed that their organizations already do require these for all or some of their new employees. And then next, while there was some degree of support for hiring individuals with criminal records, a total of 51% said that they would just automatically exclude these candidates with a positive record check, no matter what type of offense they had or how old the offense was. And then the remaining respondents showed some openness to hiring folks with a criminal record, but despite this openness, when we asked if they had ever knowingly hired a candidate with a criminal record, 73% of the respondents said that they hadn't.
Wow.
And then when we asked employers why they are conducting record checks, liability and risk management was listed as the leading reason. And this is really interesting because since risk was the number one reason listed, because research continuously shows that criminal records have very little predictive value in determining risk. So with these first 4 findings, what we're really seeing here is that overall employers are generally positive about reintegration, but when asked about their actual hiring practices, employers are generally very exclusionary when it comes to folks with criminal records. And then our last finding actually showed ways that would help those with criminal records to improve their employment opportunities. And employers here provided various suggestions, such as offering opportunities for enhancing their technical skills. So this could range from providing support with building resumes to offering specialized training related to the jobs that they're applying for. Employers also shared that providing direct support to the employer would also be helpful, as well as offering funding incentives. So this could include like covering some of the salary costs for the candidate. And then lastly would be to improve the soft skills of folks with criminal records. And then again, this could include supporting them with like interviewing skills, helping with their communication skills, or how to like resolve conflict, for example. But yeah, those are our 5 key findings that we found through the research. And then I guess I'll just pass it back over to Sophia, who will talk about some of those policy recommendations that we pulled from our research findings.
Unless we want to pause there.
Yeah. Actually, can we pause for a sec? That was a lot to digest.
Yeah, I'm very curious, Hannah, when you had mentioned that employers just sort of automatically exclude anyone with a criminal record, regardless of the type of offense on the record or the date. Like, what was there anything that showed employers are harder or maybe more lenient depending on the nature of the offense? Say, like, somebody with a dated impaired driving offense versus somebody with like a more recent violent or theft related offense. Like, is there any? Does age or type of offense play any factor at all that you've seen?
We didn't report this directly in the report that we launched on our website, but we did also include these like scenario based questions where respondents could receive like either a scenario for someone with like a drug possession or an assault charge. And what we found there was that, so we would we would ask, like, imagine you're about to hire someone who has a criminal record. Like, would you consider them for this bookkeeping job? Yes or no? And then the next question would provide a little bit more detail. So it would be like, okay, this potential candidate has a assault charge. Would you hire them? Yes or no? And then the next question would then say, this candidate has an assault charge from 10 years ago. Would you hire them? Yes or no? And then the final question would include information like, this individual has an assault charge from 10 years ago when they were a bouncer at a bar. And while they were working, someone was incredibly intoxicated and they had to remove them from the bar, and it resulted in them receiving an assault charge. And what we found was the more details that folks received, they were a little bit more willing to consider this individual for the job.
As you say, knowledge can combat the stigma that's associated with a criminal record then.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the finding kind of showed one just asked if they would hire somebody with a criminal record. The automatic answer was no.
Yes.
And so I think the key thing is whether employers, whether there is that opportunity to get that further information. Because if a lot of these folks in charge of hiring are just deciding right off the bat that any application that has a criminal record is an automatic no, then they might not be providing that space. But given the opportunity, that might change their mind, as you noted.
Interesting. And then my other question is, did you notice if there was any difference in attitude amongst employers depending on the type of job? Like, say if it was more of a kind of like a, maybe like an unskilled labor job, or like a blue collar trades job, as opposed to more of like a white collar bookkeeping or something like that. Did you find any difference in attitude depending on the type of job?
Yes. So folks from like arts, retail, construction, manufacturing were more open to and had more positive perspectives of people with criminal records. And then individuals from sectors like healthcare, finance, and government held more stigmatizing and negative attitudes towards these candidates.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it sounds like that sort of, you made that initial statement around the employers said that they had openness. But it sounds like that openness is kind of contingent on the amount of information that they're provided and what they know about that person versus just the general openness towards anyone and everyone who might come through the door.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
Interesting.
And Sophia, this may be a question for you then. So it seems to me then that the way to deal with this job is that, or with this issue, is that employers need to be educated. So what can we do to kind of educate employers about, like you said, the fact that criminal records are not predictive of risk, and that most employers who hire people with criminal records rate them quite highly? Like how do we get that information to the people who are hesitant to hire those with criminal records?
Yeah, I think the public education piece is huge, and there's a couple of things that we did include as recommendations in the report. And some of these are around sort of legislative change. So one of the things we're suggesting is legislative guidance to employers on record check policies. We heard in the research that when asked, a lot of these folks, which are all directly involved in hiring, so these are like hiring managers, and many of them noted that they weren't aware of any policies that existed at their workplace. So these sort of practices are being done a bit ad hoc. And so we're suggesting that there should be legislation that mandates certain policies around record checks and certain procedures. So for example, in Ontario, we have the Employment Standards Act that has certain guidance on, multiple things related to employment, termination, et cetera. There's also guidance on recruitment practices, so like pay transparency and things like that. And so that would be a good opportunity for us to introduce some requirements that guide record check practices within legislation to prevent sort of arbitrary exclusion of candidates with criminal records. And then in terms of action that employers can do that's not based on legislative reform, we also have started Canada's first Fair Chances Coalition. And so this has some of that education piece that you were talking about. Essentially, the coalition is employer-led, and so it's employers that have signed on to take the pledge to be fair chance hiring workplaces, which basically just means that employers are basing their decisions based on qualifications of individuals rather than just criminal records. And so it's not meaning that you can never do a criminal record check, but rather that it doesn't mean the automatic exclusion of a really qualified, strong candidate. And on the website for the Fair Chances Coalition, fairchances.ca, there's actually a number of educational resources for employers to be able to find out more about how to start to do this in their own workplaces and learn a little bit more about things like the predictive risk, the research on some of these issues, and the ways in which fair chance hiring can benefit employers. Because the facts of the matter are that this research has been done extensively in the States. And despite how Hannah said there are negative stereotypes around people with criminal records, research coming out of the US has actually found that employees with criminal records actually have lower turnover. They're more loyal employees. They have equal or higher performance, equal or lower recruitment costs. So some of these misconceptions are actually just that. They're just misconceptions, and folks that have actually hired employees with criminal records have largely had really positive experiences, and this fills a great need in workplaces that are facing labor shortages and other challenges with recruitment.
Wow, that's phenomenal. How many employers are currently a part of that Fair Chance Coalition, and how do you go about approaching employers to join your coalition?
It's a good question. There's a number on the website. It's growing all the time, so I don't have an exact number off the top of my head. But it's really about sort of building a critical mass of peers to just be able to talk to other employers, to say, we're doing this. This is how we're doing it. There's a role for everybody. So it doesn't matter what stage an employer might be in. There are opportunities to kind of join in, learn a little bit more, and then involve some of those practices within their workplaces in whatever way fits. So it's just at this point, it's kind of just spreading the word and hoping that it can start to build momentum where employers are talking to their peers and it can become more of sort of a mainstream conversation.
That's fantastic. Yeah, say that's exactly what it sounds like is needed to combat sort of the negative stereotypes that exist there. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, we also, I mean, there are some other recommendations that we have in the report. Some of it is around human rights protections. So I think PEI is one of the provinces in Canada that have more robust human rights protections when it comes to criminal records than Ontario does. In Ontario, under the protected grounds, it's record of offenses, which is only provincial offenses, so like Highway Traffic Act, and criminal convictions that have received a record suspension or a pardon.
Gotcha.
So it's pretty limited. There's not a lot of protections against discrimination for people with criminal records, and that's one of the other areas that we're recommending Ontario catch up to provinces like PEI, BC, Quebec that have more robust protections in their human rights code. And then some of the other pieces that we're calling for, a bit of a federal ask, but to reform the Criminal Records Act to fix the current record suspension regime. So a lot of people ask, if you have a really old record, why don't you just go get a record suspension or a pardon and get rid of it so you can have better prospects? But the current process as it stands is extremely cumbersome. It's really restrictive. A lot of people who would otherwise, qualify aren't able to get the application form done. It can sometimes be for really long, really old offenses. It's really difficult to even gather all the necessary paperwork. And so we're advocating for a spent regime whereby after a certain amount of time, people's records are automatically suspended. So it would allow a lot more people to be able to successfully move on from their past criminal justice involvement and try to get past those barriers to employment.
And do you know if provincially in Ontario, or maybe even federally when we're dealing with RCMP and stuff like that, I know sometimes somebody may be charged with an offense, and then that offense will not wind up on their criminal record. Either the charges are stayed or that's dealt with in some alternative way. So there's no necessarily criminal record, but there can still be a record that they were arrested and charged with the offense. I think they refer to that as sort of I forget what they call it, like non-conviction related, like offense related information though. And some of these police detachments will keep that information, fingerprints and stuff like that of people that can still show up on background checks. Do you know if there's a push or if there's any kind of initiative to try and get the police forces in situations where charges don't wind up in a conviction to just get rid of that information so it can't be disclosed?
Well, in Ontario, we actually have the Police Record Check Reform Act, which I think is quite unique to Ontario. But it sets out and has standardized what information is released on the different levels of criminal record check. Okay. So this issue of non-conviction information coming up was a really big issue and one that we were actually involved in a number of years ago, because the other, the example you gave, but also people with mental health issues where the police were called, that type of information was coming up on criminal record checks for job purposes. Things like when people were just stopped by police but never charged with anything. And so that, as you can imagine, would disproportionately impact like Black and brown folks as well. And so we're seeing those sort of practices kind of coming up and records coming up when people were going for jobs as well. So the Police Record Check Reform Act standardized that and limited the information that can be released on criminal record checks. And so there's certain information that can be released about things like outstanding charges and warrants, but that would be on the middle level of check. So there's like a basic criminal record check that's mostly convictions. Then it increases in the amount of information that can come out, but it did provide a bit of guidance so that we're not sort of seeing non-conviction information come up as readily on criminal record checks here.
Yeah, no, that's great. I wish we had something similar in that in PEI, because something I see is that, I know we're talking in the employment realm here, but it can also have very significant immigration consequences for people as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm curious how it is in PEI. You were talking about some housing updates earlier, because we're hearing too that criminal record checks are becoming more common with housing providers. So when people are filling out applications for housing, they're also being asked if they have a criminal record, and that's another opportunity to exclude people with past justice involvement in there. Is that something you're seeing in PEI?
Yeah, it definitely is becoming more common. And the tricky part about it is, even if it's considered, not a requirement or not something that someone's allowed to demand as part of the requirement for tenancy, they can just refuse someone for other reasons if they deny providing the criminal record check.
Yeah.
So that is one of the things that we see. I think it's still probably more common in Ontario than it is out here, but it definitely has been growing as people become increasingly able to be particular about the people that they choose to put in their units, given the supply and demand issue.
Yeah, the housing crisis, which doesn't seem to be letting up at all, is certainly contributes to a lot more selectivity on the part of landlords, and that can be, as Josh said, even if you're not required to provide it, the fact of not providing it, may trigger a landlord to try and to move on to a different tenant.
It's kind of that like guilty till proven innocent sort of a stance, right?
Yeah, certainly. And that stigma is pretty persistent in different areas. And that's sort of the reason why we advocate for really targeted supports. I mean, even in the employment space, another recommendation is around dedicated investment in specialized programs for people exiting the justice system, and employment programs where people are well trained. And I know you probably know this quite well, but just to manage the additional stigma and the barriers that exist for people with criminal records, and similar in the housing space, how we can have more targeted investment into housing streams for individuals with past justice involvement.
And I mean, the sort of the real tragedy about this whole thing is that the very thing that landlords or employers are afraid of is that people with past criminal justice involvement are going to engage in that type of activity, either on the job or in housing. The research shows, and the federal framework to reduce recidivism, of which housing and employment are key pillars, is that employment and stable housing are two of the very factors that prevent those things from occurring.
Yeah, exactly. Those are key in successful reintegration. And so it's those two things where there are persistent barriers that are actually the key to providing, public safety, to prevent reoffending, to prevent recidivism, and to allow people to be able to move on from their past justice involvement.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of public education that needs to be done, and it's phenomenal that you guys have done that research and are out there doing that work. So that's just great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You had mentioned earlier about sort of revising the legislation around some consistency or some standardization among criminal record checks for employers. Did you have a sense of like what that might look like in terms of recommendations, or how you would encourage that to look?
Yeah, certainly. So we have actually been compiling, and this will be probably another report coming out next year with a bit more expanding on that recommendation and what that could actually look like. But some of the recommendations that we've made is just that there should be some standardization around how criminal record checks are done. So certainly workplaces should have policies around this where they can actually think about some of these things ahead of time so that there's consistency across recruitment. And some of the suggestions that we have are that publicly advertised job postings should include in the posting information about whether a criminal record check will be required, and which level of check, as we have those quite standardized in Ontario. And if a record check is required but is not an automatic disqualifying factor, this should also be stated in the job posting. And this is also to help with the issue of self-selecting. So we know a lot of people with criminal records will sometimes self-select out of potential job opportunities because they assume it's a lost cause and there's no point. And that's really a shame for the individual, the job seeker, but also for that employer that might be missing out on really an untapped pool of talent and really qualified job seekers. So a little bit more clarity on whether criminal record checks are required, what type, and if it won't be a disqualifying factor. And then we're also recommending that criminal record checks be conducted after a conditional offer of employment has been made, and to put in place policies to limit access of the results of criminal record checks to protect the privacy of the worker. So really in line with that fair chance hiring practices and fair assessment of a candidate, if an individual has made it through the entire recruitment process, doing record checks at the time where you would normally do things like reference checks. So you're just sort of doing that extra due diligence, but have already assessed the candidate based on their merit and their qualifications.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think you say the idea around sort of policies for the workplace is such a good idea. If you think about it, I mean, the whole purpose of running a criminal record check, I mean, should be in some way related to the nature of the job, right? So, I mean, I think if you're hiring someone for an accounting job or something where somebody's going to have a lot of access to money, well, maybe you do want to look out for somebody with, a multitude of fraud convictions or something of that nature. But if the criminal record isn't rationally connected to the job purpose in any way, right? I mean, it shouldn't necessarily be a barrier. So I think if employers would take a minute to say, okay, what is it that we're really need to look out for here, right? I mean, that could definitely help the process, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. I think a huge part of it is considering in advance for this position we're hiring for, is this a position that requires a criminal record check at all?
Yeah.
And then if it does, what level of check is most appropriate? Because you don't necessarily need to go to the more restrictive level if you just need to know about convictions.
Yep.
And then also thinking ahead of time about what convictions are relevant. Because as you said, certainly if you're hiring for a bookkeeping position or something really finance related, you might be interested in fraud charges. But if you're, for example, hiring for a remote position where nobody's ever required to even come into the office and somebody has a DUI from 15 years ago, is that relevant? Probably not. So it's really ensuring that there's that consideration of what would be relevant in the circumstances, and that's done sort of ahead of time so that there is consistency when a criminal record check is conducted.
Absolutely, yeah, and like I say, one would hope that employers take the time, because they say then hopefully that cuts down on this sort of just, oh, there's a criminal record, I'll automatically they go in automatically in the rejected pile.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, particularly when, as you alluded to earlier, the process for getting those records suspended is time-consuming and difficult.
Yeah.
Very difficult. Yeah, we hear a lot of stories of, we had one individual who had a theft from decades earlier. And it was one of those silly things from university, coming back from the bar late at night and decided to steal a bike. And this was 20 years later, and that record was still following him around because the record was so old that the court documents that were required to complete an application for a record suspension were no longer existent at the courts. So there was just administratively, there's no way to get a record suspension or apply for one. And so that person was then dealing with having this record pop up every time they applied for a job. And it was extremely difficult to move past it. So we hear examples like that all the time where we have a system that is extremely cumbersome and a lot of administrative issues, and it prevents a lot of people from moving on from their previous records.
So you had alluded to like another report that's coming out next year. So based on this research that you've done, is there any current research being done or planned to kind of follow up on this study?
So we are doing some work right now on expanding on some of these recommendations. So we did put in some recommendations into this report, but we really wanted to workshop those a little bit, delve into them, and get feedback from a number of different stakeholders. And so we've been doing that over the past couple months. And so we're hoping to release a report next year that goes into a bit more detail and provides some additional context about how we can actually move forward on some of these changes, what they could look like, with feedback from a number of different stakeholders who work in the system, who do employment programming, for example, or who have sort of policy and other interests in the employment space.
Very good. Excellent.
Okay. I think that kind of answers the questions and curiosities I had. Did you have anything else you wanted to ask about, Conor?
No, I think that's everything. Unless there's anything else you guys, either Sophia or Hannah, that you'd like to add.
I think that's it for us. Yeah, thank you so much for having us on. It was great to be able to chat about this work.
Yeah, and when we post the podcast on our website and YouTube channel, if you want to send the links to the fair chances and to the research to us, then we can add that there so that people have an opportunity to go check out the report and check out the fair chances information that you share.
Yeah, certainly. We love that.
Mm-hmm. That would be great.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time to jump on with us. We will be back next month on November 15th.
Yes.
To meet with another guest and another John Howard related guest that we're very excited about.
Oh, excellent.
So we'll be back then. As always, you can find the podcast through our website, through our YouTube channel here, just John Howard Society of PEI. Sophia, Hannah, thank you so much for joining. Conor, thanks for riding alongside.
My pleasure as always.
Everybody has a great day and a great Thanksgiving weekend.
Yes, absolutely. Long weekend coming up.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.